The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was drinking my second cup of coffee and trying to forget that my 17-year-old son had come home at 3 a.m. smelling like marijuana and defiance. The envelope bore the official seal of Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, and inside was a notice that made my blood pressure spike higher than it had been since my cardiologist threatened to put me on beta blockers. "Violation notice, second offense," the header screamed in bold red letters. Below it, in the passive-aggressive tone that only HOA boards could perfect, was a detailed list of infractions allegedly committed by the property at 124-7 Maple Ridge Drive, my property. My home, where I'd been paying a mortgage for 12 years, where I'd raised 2 kids, where I'd buried 3 dogs in the backyard and planted the oak tree that now shaded half the house. According to Mrs. Patricia Henley, HOA president and self-appointed guardian of suburban perfection, my mailbox was non-compliant with community standards due to fading paint and rust spots. My front lawn contained unsightly brown patches exceeding the allowable threshold. Most infuriating of all, my garbage cans were apparently visible from the street beyond the permitted display window. The fine was $500. I read the notice 3 times, each pass making me angrier than the last. This was the woman who'd been making my life miserable for the past 6 months, ever since she'd been elected HOA president on a platform of maintaining property values through strict adherence to community standards. Translation, making everyone's life hell with her measuring tape and binoculars. "You've got to be kidding me," I muttered, setting down my coffee mug harder than necessary. The sound echoed through the kitchen where my wife Sarah used to sit every morning, reading her iPad and commenting on whatever political drama was unfolding. But Sarah wasn't here anymore. She was living in a downtown condo with her yoga instructor, leaving me to navigate the suburban minefield alone. My phone buzzed. A text from my boss. "Need the Morrison report by noon. Client moved up the meeting." Perfect. Just perfect. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door, the violation notice crumpled in my fist. The Morrison report could wait. I had 12 years of frustration to unleash on Patricia Henley, and I wasn't going to do it over the phone. The Willowbrook Estates Community Center sat at the heart of our subdivision like a monument to middle-class aspirations. Brick facade, manicured landscaping, and a parking lot full of SUVs that cost more than some people's houses. I'd attended exactly 3 HOA meetings in 12 years, 2 when we first moved in and were still optimistic about community involvement, and 1 last year when they tried to ban basketball hoops in driveways. Each time, I'd left more convinced that homeowners associations were where reasonable people went to die. Patricia Henley's office was tucked behind the main meeting room, a cramped space she'd somehow convinced the board to let her use as her administrative headquarters. The nameplate on her door read, "Patricia Henley, Community Standards Director," in gold lettering that probably violated someone's aesthetic sensibilities. I knocked once and walked in without waiting for permission. She was sitting behind a desk that looked like it had been salvaged from a government office circa 1987, surrounded by filing cabinets and binders labeled with things like Landscape Compliance 2023 and Architectural Review Guidelines. Patricia herself was exactly what central casting would order for uptight suburban busybody. Perfectly styled gray hair, reading glasses on a chain, and the kind of aggressive smile that dental hygienists use right before they tell you about your gum disease. "Mr. Davidson," she said, not looking up from whatever form she was annotating with a red pen. "I assume you're here about your violation notice." "You're damn right I am." I dropped into the chair across from her desk and tossed the crumpled notice onto her pristine blotter. $500 because my mailbox needs paint and I put my garbage cans out 12 hours early? She finally looked up. her smile shifting from dental hygienist to funeral director. Mr. Davidson. Davidson. Community standards exist for a reason. When homeowners fail to maintain their properties, it affects everyone's property values. I'm sure you understand that. What I understand is that you're manufacturing problems where none exist. My mailbox has a few rust spots. My lawn has brown patches because it's August in Texas and we're in the middle of a drought. And my garbage cans were out early because I had to leave town for work and forgot to set my alarm. Nevertheless, the violations are documented and witnessed. The fines are clearly outlined in the community covenant that you signed when you purchased your home. I leaned forward, fighting the urge to sweep her perfectly organized desk onto the floor. Patricia, let me ask you something. Do you have anything better to do with your time than drive around the neighborhood looking for chipped paint and brown grass? Her smile disappeared entirely. Mr. Davidson, I take my responsibilities to this community very seriously. Perhaps if you took your responsibilities as a homeowner equally seriously, we wouldn't be having this conversation. My responsibilities? I stood up, my chair scraping against the linoleum floor. Lady, I've been a homeowner since before you moved to this neighborhood. I've paid my dues, literally and figuratively. I've served on the volunteer fire department, coached Little League, and never once called the cops on my neighbors for playing music too loud or parking in the wrong spot. But you show up and suddenly everyone's a criminal because their hedge is 6 inches too tall or their mailbox isn't the approved shade of black. She picked up her red pen like a weapon. The community covenant is very clear about maintenance standards. If you'd like to contest the violations, you're welcome to appear before the Architectural Review Committee next month. Until then, the fines stand. I stared at her for a long moment, wondering how someone could live their entire life with such a complete absence of perspective. Here I was, 46 years old, divorced, trying to hold my family together and keep my job, and this woman thought my biggest problem should be whether my mailbox met her aesthetic standards. You know what, Patricia? You're right. The community covenant is very clear. So clear that I think I'm going to read every word of it. And then I'm going to read the city codes and the county regulations, and I'm going to make sure that every single property in this neighborhood is in perfect compliance with every rule that exists. Her eyebrows drew together in the first sign of uncertainty I'd seen from her. I'm not sure what you're implying, Mr. Davidson. I'm not implying anything. I'm telling you exactly what I'm going to do. You want to play by the rules? Fine, let's play by all the rules. I walked out without another word, leaving the violation notice on her desk like a declaration of war. The drive home gave me time to cool down, which was unfortunate because anger was the only thing keeping me from thinking about everything else that was falling apart in my life. Sarah had taken half our savings and most of our furniture, leaving me with a mortgage I could barely afford and a house that echoed with the ghosts of better times. My son Jake was 17 and acting like I was the enemy, coming home late, grades slipping, and responding to every attempt at conversation with shrugs and eye rolls. My daughter Emma was away at college, calling just often enough to ask for money and remind me how much happier she was anywhere but home. And now I had Patricia Henley adding insult to injury, literally. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for a moment, looking at my house with fresh eyes. The mailbox did have some rust spots. The lawn was more brown than green in places. The garbage cans were still sitting by the curb because I'd forgotten to bring them in after the morning pickup. By Patricia's standards, my property was probably a blight on the neighborhood. But it was my blight. I'd earned every rust spot and brown patch through 12 years of living here, working here, raising my kids here. This wasn't just a house. It was the place where Jake had learned to ride his bike, where Emma had practiced violin until the neighbors probably wanted to file noise complaints, where Sarah and I had spent countless evenings on the back deck talking about our dreams and plans. Now Sarah was gone. The kids were grown or growing away from me, and Patricia Henley wanted to fine me for not keeping up appearances. I went inside and fired up my laptop, pulling up the Willowbrook Estates Community Covenant for the first time since we'd signed it 12 years ago. It was a dense document, 47 pages of rules and regulations covering everything from acceptable paint colors to the maximum height of Christmas decorations. As I read through it, I started to understand Patricia's power trip. The document gave the HOA board extraordinary authority over homeowners' lives, with fines and penalties for infractions both major and minor. But it also gave homeowners certain rights and protections. And more importantly, it required the HOA itself to follow specific procedures and maintain certain standards. I spent the rest of the evening reading, taking notes, and cross-referencing the covenant with city and county codes. By midnight, I had a plan. It wasn't a particularly mature plan, but it was going to be satisfying as hell. The next morning, I called in sick to work, something I hadn't done in 3 years, and drove to the city planning department. The building was one of those utilitarian government structures that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd read about architecture but never actually seen a building they liked. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed over worn carpeting and motivational posters that probably dated back to the Clinton administration. I found my way to the Code Enforcement Division, where a tired-looking woman named Janet Martinez listened to my story with the patient expression of someone who'd heard it all before. "So you want to file complaints against other homeowners in your neighborhood?" she asked, glancing at the list I'd prepared. "Not exactly," I said. "I want to request inspections to ensure compliance with city codes. According to the Municipal Code, Section 14.2.1, any citizen can request a property inspection if they have reason to believe violations may exist." Janet raised an eyebrow. "You've been doing your homework." 12 hours worth. Look, I'm not trying to cause trouble for my neighbors, but if the HOA is going to hold everyone to impossible standards, then everyone should be held to the same standards, including the HOA president. She leaned back in her chair. "What kind of violations are we talking about?" I consulted my notes. Potential zoning violations for home businesses operating without permits, building code violations for unpermitted additions and modifications, environmental violations for improper drainage and landscaping, and safety violations for non-compliant electrical and plumbing work. And you have reason to believe these violations exist? I have 12 years of living in the neighborhood and paying attention. Plus, I spent yesterday afternoon walking around with a copy of the city codes and a camera. Janet was quiet for a moment, studying my face. "You know this is going to create a lot of headaches for everyone involved, right? Including you?" "I'm already dealing with headaches. At least this way, they'll be distributed more fairly." She sighed and pulled out a stack of forms. "All right, Mr. Davidson, let's see what you've got." The inspection request forms were surprisingly straightforward. Each one required a property address, the specific code sections potentially being violated, and a brief description of the suspected violations. I had 17 addresses and 43 potential violations. Patricia Henley's house topped the list. Her property at 1205 Maple Ridge Drive was a sprawling 2-story colonial that dominated its corner lot like a suburban castle. Over the years, I'd watched her make modifications and improvements with the same aggressive perfectionism she brought to HOA enforcement. What I discovered during my research was that several of those improvements had been made without the proper permits. The most obvious violation was the addition shed built onto the back of her house 3 years ago. According to city records, no building permits had been issued for 1205 Maple Ridge Drive since 1998. But the addition was clearly visible from the street, a sunroom with floor-to-ceiling windows and a deck that extended well into what should have been the required rear setback area. Then there was her home office, Patricia ran a consulting business from her house, which was perfectly legal as long as she had the proper home business permit and stayed within the restrictions for residential areas. But I'd seen the steady stream of clients coming and going, the commercial signage in her window, and the fact that she'd converted her three-car garage into office space, none of which appeared on any city permits. The landscaping was another issue. Patricia installed an elaborate irrigation system that included drainage modifications to redirect water runoff from her property to the street. The work appeared to violate both the city's drainage ordinances and the environmental protection codes for the watershed area. I filled out the forms methodically, documenting each potential violation with photographs and specific code references. By the time I was finished, I had enough paperwork to keep city inspectors busy for weeks. Janet reviewed my submissions with growing amazement. "Mr. Davidson, are you sure you're not in the construction business?" "I'm in sales, but I've been a homeowner for 20 years, and I know how to read code books. Plus, I'm motivated." "I can see that. Well, these all appear to be legitimate requests. We'll schedule the inspections and send notice to the property owners. They'll have a chance to respond and address any violations we find." "How long does the process take?" "Depends on what we find and how cooperative the property owners are. Could be a few weeks, could be several months. Major violations can result in fines, forced corrections, or even liens against the property." I thanked Janet and headed home feeling better than I had in months. For the first time since Sarah left, I felt like I was taking control of something instead of just reacting to whatever crisis came next. My phone was ringing when I walked in the door. The caller ID showed my son's school. "Mr. Davidson, this is Principal Carter at Willowbrook High. I need you to come in to discuss Jake's behavior this morning." The brief satisfaction of my morning evaporated like steam. What happened? "There was an incident in his chemistry class. I'd rather discuss the details in person. Can you be here in the next hour?" I looked at my watch. It was barely noon, and my day was already falling apart again. "I'll be right there." Willowbrook High School looked exactly like every suburban high school built in the last 30 years. Brick and glass, sprawling single-story design, parking lots full of cars that cost more than my first house. I'd been here countless times over the years for parent-teacher conferences, school plays, and athletic events, but walking into the principal's office never got less intimidating. Principal Carter was a heavy-set man in his 50s who looked like he'd rather be coaching football than dealing with teenage drama. He gestured for me to sit across from his desk, where Jake was already slouched in a chair, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Jake was involved in an incident during third-period chemistry, Carter began. He and another student got into a physical altercation that resulted in damage to lab equipment and disruption of the entire class. I looked at my son, who was staring at his hands and refusing to make eye contact. At 17, Jake had grown taller than me but still carried himself with the awkward uncertainty of adolescence. His dark hair hung over his eyes, and there was a small cut on his knuckles that hadn't been there when he'd left for school that morning. "What kind of altercation?" I asked. According to witnesses, Jake became verbally aggressive with Trevor Morrison over comments Trevor made about his family situation. The confrontation escalated to pushing and shoving, during which a microscope was knocked over and broken. The family situation, of course. In a town like Willowbrook, everyone knew everyone's business, and our divorce had provided plenty of gossip for the community. I could only imagine what Trevor Morrison, whose father happened to be one of the clients I was supposed to be preparing a report for, had said about Sarah leaving or about our financial struggles. "Jake," I said quietly, "is this what happened?" He finally looked up, and I saw a flash of the anger and hurt that he'd been carrying around since his mother left. He said, "Mom left because you're a loser who can't even keep his own family together." He said everyone knows we're broke and that's why she moved out. The words hit me like a physical blow. Not because they were entirely wrong, but because they came from my son's mouth with such raw pain behind them. This was what he'd been carrying around, what he'd been angry about, what he'd been trying to process while I'd been focused on my own hurt and anger. Principal Carter cleared his throat. Regardless of the provocation, physical violence is not acceptable. Jake will be suspended for the rest of the week, and he'll need to pay for the damaged microscope. The cost is $847. $847 on top of the $500 HOA fine. And I still had the Morrison report to finish, assuming I still had a job after missing a client meeting to deal with my son's disciplinary problems. I understand, I said. Jake, we'll discuss this at home. The drive home was silent, except for the sound of classic rock playing quietly on the radio. I kept glancing at Jake in the passenger seat, trying to find the right words to bridge the distance that had grown between us over the past year. But everything I thought of sounded like the kind of empty parental platitudes that I'd hated when I was his age. Finally, as we pulled into the driveway, I turned off the engine and faced him. Your mom didn't leave because I'm a loser, Jake. She left because we stopped being happy together. It happens to a lot of people, and it doesn't mean there's something wrong with you or that our family is broken beyond repair. He stared out the windshield at our house, at the rust-spotted mailbox and the brown patches in the lawn that had somehow become symbols of my failure to hold everything together. But we are broke, aren't we? He said quietly, and Trevor's right about people talking. I wanted to lie, to tell him that everything was fine and that money didn't matter, but Jake was 17, not 7, and he deserved honesty, even if it was uncomfortable. We're not broke, but money is tighter than it used to be. The divorce was expensive, and maintaining 2 households costs more than maintaining 1. But we're not in danger of losing the house or going hungry. We just can't buy everything we want anymore. Is that why you were so angry about the HOA fine? I almost laughed. Here I'd been raging about Patricia Henley and her petty tyranny, and my son had seen right through to the real issue. The fine wasn't just an annoyance, it was money we couldn't afford to waste, another bill in a growing pile of obligations that were squeezing our budget tighter every month. Partly, I admitted, but mostly I was angry because it felt unfair, like someone was kicking us when we're already down. Jake was quiet for a moment, picking at the cut on his knuckles. Are you going to fight it? Actually, yes. I spent yesterday filing complaints against half the neighborhood, including the HOA president. If they want to play hardball, we'll play hardball. For the first time in months, Jake smiled. It was a small smile, cautious and uncertain, but it was genuine. Really? You're going after Mrs. Henley? With both barrels. She wants to fine us for rust spots and brown grass? Fine. But I'm going to make sure every property in this neighborhood meets every code requirement that exists. That's kind of badass, Dad. Coming from a 17-year-old who usually treated me like I was barely evolved beyond single-celled organisms, it was the highest compliment I'd received in months. We went inside, and I made grilled cheese sandwiches while Jake told me more about what had been happening at school. The divorce had made him a target for gossip and speculation, and several kids had been making comments about our family situation. Trevor Morrison was just the latest and most obnoxious. The thing is, Jake said, taking a bite of his sandwich, most of their parents are screwed up too. Trevor's dad cheats on his mom all the time, and everyone knows it. But they act like we're the freaks because mom and dad actually got divorced instead of just pretending everything's fine. It was a perceptive observation from a kid who was still figuring out how the adult world worked. Suburbia was full of perfect-looking families hiding imperfect realities, but we'd become the cautionary tale because our problems were visible. People are going to talk regardless, I said. The question is whether you let their opinions matter more than what you know to be true about yourself and your family. Is that why you're going after the HOA? Because you don't want to let them push us around? I considered the question while I cleaned up our dishes. Was this about principle, or was it about pride? Was I standing up for what was right, or was I just lashing out because I felt powerless in other areas of my life? Maybe both, I said finally. But sometimes standing up for yourself and doing the right thing are the same action. My phone buzzed with a text message. The name on the screen made me groan. Patricia Henley. Mr. Davidson, I've just received notice from the city that you filed multiple inspection requests for properties in our neighborhood. This kind of retaliatory harassment is unacceptable and may violate the community covenant's good neighbor clause. I strongly suggest you withdraw these requests before this matter escalates further. I showed the text to Jake, who read it with growing amusement. She sounds scared, he said. She should be. I did my homework. I typed back a response. Mrs. Henley, I'm simply exercising my rights as a citizen to ensure that all properties in our community meet the same high standards you've been enforcing. I'm sure you'll understand. Her response came back within minutes. This conversation is not over, Mr. Davidson. Looking forward to it, I replied. Jake was grinning now, the first genuine happiness I'd seen from him since before the divorce. This is going to be epic. Maybe it was poor parenting to involve my son in what was essentially a petty neighborhood war, but seeing him engaged and excited about something, even something as trivial as taking down the HOA president, felt like a small victory. The first city inspector arrived 3 days later, a methodical man named Rodriguez who spent 2 hours examining Patricia Henley's property with a measuring tape, a camera, and a clipboard full of violation notices. I watched from my kitchen window as he documented the unpermitted addition, the commercial signage, and the drainage modifications that I'd reported. Patricia emerged from her house halfway through the inspection, dressed in a power suit that was probably intended to intimidate city employees, but only succeeded in making her look like she was trying too hard. I couldn't hear the conversation, but her body language suggested it wasn't well. Rodriguez left her with a thick stack of paperwork and a promise that she'd receive formal violation notices within 10 business days. My phone rang 20 minutes later. "You son of a bitch!" Patricia's voice was tight with barely controlled fury. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I've ensured that community standards are being enforced fairly and consistently," I said, borrowing her own bureaucratic language. "Isn't that what you wanted?" "This is harassment, pure and simple. I'm going to file a complaint with the police, and I'm going to pursue every legal option available to stop this vendetta." "Mrs. Henley, I haven't done anything illegal or unethical. I've simply requested that city inspectors verify compliance with existing codes. If your property meets all the requirements, you have nothing to worry about." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she said finally. "Actually, I think I do. You're someone who's gotten used to bullying people without consequences. But consequences have a way of catching up with everyone eventually." This time, she did hang up. Jake was waiting in the kitchen when I ended the call, having obviously listened to my end of the conversation. "She's really pissed," he observed. "Good. Maybe now she'll understand how it feels to be on the receiving end of bureaucratic harassment." Over the next week, city inspectors descended on Willowbrook Estates like a plague of clipboard-carrying locusts. They examined drainage systems, measured setbacks, reviewed permit records, and documented violations with the methodical efficiency of government employees who'd finally been given clear direction and adequate evidence. The results exceeded even my optimistic expectations. Patricia Henley's property alone generated 14 separate violation notices, covering everything from the unpermitted addition to improper business signage to drainage code violations. The estimated cost of bringing her property into compliance was over $40,000, and that didn't include the fines and penalties that would accrue if the violations weren't corrected within the specified time frames. But she wasn't the only one facing problems. Mrs. Chen at 189 Maple Ridge had converted her garage into a rental apartment without permits. The Johnsons at 1156 had installed a swimming pool that violated setback requirements. Half the neighborhood had landscaping drainage issues, unpermitted decks, or home businesses operating without proper licenses. By Friday afternoon, the Willowbrook Estates Community Center parking lot looked like a gathering of the angry and confused. Homeowners clutched violation notices and argued with each other about who was to blame for the sudden scrutiny. Several people had hired attorneys. Others were getting estimates from contractors for expensive remediation work. And through it all, Patricia Henley's house sat at the center of the controversy like a monument to regulatory hypocrisy. I was grilling burgers in my backyard when she finally came to see me. Jake was at a friend's house, which was probably for the best given the level of hostility radiating from her as she marched across my lawn. "You've destroyed this neighborhood," she said without preamble. "People are panicking about these violation notices. Property values are going to plummet when word gets out about all these code violations." I flipped a burger and didn't look up. Funny how that works, isn't it? When you were issuing fines for rust spots and brown grass, you claimed it was about maintaining property values. But when actual code violations get exposed, suddenly property values don't matter anymore. Those were legitimate HOA violations based on community standards that everyone agreed to when they bought their homes. And these are legitimate code violations based on city and county standards that everyone agreed to when they built or modified their homes. What's the difference? She moved closer, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. The difference is that my violations were designed to maintain order and standards in our community. Your violations are designed to cause chaos and revenge. I finally looked up from the grill, meeting her gaze directly. "No, Patricia, my violations are designed to prove a point. You can't selectively enforce standards based on personal grudges or power trips. If we're going to live in a community with rules, then the rules apply to everyone equally, including you." "This isn't over, Davidson. I'm going to fight every one of these violation notices. I'm going to hire the best attorneys in the state. And when I'm done, I'm going to sue you for harassment and intentional infliction of emotional distress." Good luck with that. Everything I did was legal and within my rights as a citizen. But I'll tell you what, I'm willing to call a truce. Her eyebrows shot up. What kind of truce? You withdraw the HOA violations against my property, and I'll help you navigate the city violation process. I've learned a lot about building codes over the past week, and I think I can help you figure out the most cost-effective way to bring your property into compliance. She stared at me for a long moment, her expression shifting between anger, suspicion, and calculation. "And if I don't agree to your truce?" I shrugged and turned back to the grill. "Then we both spend the next year fighting expensive legal battles while your unpermitted addition gets condemned and my mailbox stays exactly as rusty as it is right now." "You're bluffing. The city can't force me to tear down an addition that's been in place for 3 years. Actually, they can, and they will if you don't bring it into compliance or get retroactive permits. Which might be difficult since the addition violates setback requirements that can't be waived. But like I said, I'm willing to help you figure out alternatives." The calculation won out over the anger in her expression. Patricia Henley might be a petty tyrant, but she wasn't stupid. She understood leverage when she saw it, and she was smart enough to recognize when she was in a losing position. "What exactly are you proposing?" I turned off the grill and faced her directly. "I'm proposing that we both act like adults. You stop using the HOA as your personal enforcement agency to harass homeowners over trivial violations. I stop filing city inspection requests every time someone's hedge grows 2 inches too tall. And we work together to help everyone in the neighborhood resolve their code violations with the minimum amount of cost and hassle. And the fines you've already issued? Withdrawn. But in return, you agree to reasonable enforcement standards for HOA violations going forward. No more fines for rust spots or brown patches or garbage cans that are out 12 hours early. Focus on violations that actually affect property values or community safety. She was quiet for several minutes, staring at my house with the expression of someone doing complex mental calculations. How do I know you won't just file more inspection requests if we have future disagreements? Because I don't want to spend my life fighting with my neighbors any more than you want to spend yours defending against code violations. This whole thing has been exhausting for everyone involved, but it's also proven a point that needed proving, which is that power comes with responsibility. And if you're going to wield power over other people's lives, you better make damn sure your own house is in order first. It was a mixed metaphor, but the point was clear enough. Patricia Henley had learned the hard way that her authority as HOA president came with limits, and that those limits were enforced by people who had more power and bigger sticks than she did. "I need to think about this," she said finally. "Take your time, but keep in mind that those violation notices have deadlines, and the fines start accruing whether we're friends or enemies." She nodded curtly and walked back across my lawn, her power suit slightly wrinkled and her perfect composure showing cracks around the edges. Jake came home an hour later with grass stains on his jeans and the satisfied look of someone who'd spent the afternoon playing pickup basketball instead of thinking about family drama or a school suspensions. "How'd it go with the Ice Queen?" he asked, stealing a leftover burger from the platter. "Better than expected. I think we might have reached an understanding." "Does this mean we won?" I considered the question while I cleaned up the grill. Had we won? Patricia would probably withdraw the HOA fines, which saved us $500 we couldn't afford to lose. The neighborhood would eventually sort out their code violations, probably with less drama and expense than anyone feared. And maybe, if we were all lucky, the Willowbrook Estates HOA would evolve into something resembling a reasonable organization focused on genuine community issues rather than petty enforcement of aesthetic preferences. But winning implied there had been a contest with clear sides and obvious stakes. What we'd really done was prove that systems of power only work when everyone agrees to play by the same rules. Patricia had been using her position to impose her will without accountability, and I'd used the city's bureaucratic power to impose consequences she hadn't expected. In the end, we'd both learned something about the limits of our authority and the price of abusing power. "I think we all won," I said finally, "or at least we all learned something important." Jake nodded sagely, as if profound insights about suburban politics were exactly what he'd expected from his old man. At 17, he still believed that most adult problems had clear solutions if you were just smart enough or brave enough to implement them. I envied him that certainty, even as I hoped he'd keep some of it as he got older and discovered how complicated the world really was. The official notice came on Monday morning, delivered by the same postal service that had brought Patricia's violation notice 2 weeks earlier. This time, the envelope contained a letter from the Willowbrook Estates HOA board formally withdrawing all violations and fines against my property and apologizing for any inconvenience caused by administrative errors in the enforcement process. There was also a separate note from Patricia, written on personal stationery in her careful handwriting. "Mr. Davidson, I would appreciate the opportunity to discuss community standards and enforcement procedures at your convenience. Perhaps we can find common ground that serves everyone's interests. Sincerely, Patricia Henley." It was as close to an admission of defeat as I was likely to get from someone who'd built her identity around being right about everything. I called her that afternoon, and we met at the community center the next evening, sitting across from each other at the same table where I'd attended those 3 painful HOA meetings over the years. But this time, there were no other board members present, no parliamentary procedures, and no formal agenda. Just 2 middle-aged homeowners trying to figure out how to coexist in the same neighborhood without making each other miserable. "I want to apologize," Patricia began, which caught me off guard. "I may have been overzealous in my enforcement of community standards. The violations against your property were, perhaps, unnecessarily harsh given the circumstances." It wasn't a full apology, but it was more than I'd expected from someone who'd probably never admitted to being wrong about anything in her adult life. I appreciate that. And I want to apologize for the way I handled my response. Filing inspection requests for half the neighborhood was probably overkill. "Probably," she agreed with the ghost of a smile. "But it was effective." We spent the next hour working out what Patricia called revised enforcement protocols and what I thought of as common-sense guidelines for not being a terrible neighbor. The new standards focused on genuine health, safety, and property value issues while eliminating the petty violations that had made the HOA a source of community tension rather than community improvement. No more fines for minor cosmetic issues like faded paint or small brown patches in lawns. No more measuring garbage can placement with rulers or timing their placement to the minute. And, most importantly, no more surprise violations issued without prior notice and an opportunity to address problems voluntarily. In return, I agreed to help Patricia navigate the city violation process for her property and to serve as an informal advisor on future enforcement issues. It was a role I'd never wanted, but one that made sense given my recent crash course in municipal codes and regulations. "There's one more thing," Patricia said as we wrapped up our negotiation. "I'd like you to consider running for the HOA board next year. We need people with your perspective and knowledge." I almost laughed. 6 months ago, I would have rather eaten glass than get involved in HOA politics. But the events of the past few weeks had shown me that avoiding civic responsibility didn't make the problems go away. It just left the field open for people like Patricia to fill the vacuum with their own agendas. "I'll think about it," I said, which was more commitment than I'd ever imagined making to suburban governance. The next few months brought a gradual return to something resembling normal life in Willowbrook Estates. Property owners worked with city inspectors to address code violations, most of which turned out to be less expensive to fix than anyone had feared. Patricia's addition required some modifications and retroactive permits, but she managed to avoid the worst-case scenario of demolition. The drainage issues that affected multiple properties were resolved through a community-wide solution that actually improved the neighborhood's flood resistance. More importantly, the HOA evolved into something more reasonable and collaborative. Patricia remained president, but her enforcement style became less aggressive and more focused on education and voluntary compliance. The community newsletter started including helpful information about city codes and permit requirements instead of just scolding notices about violation fines. Jake's suspension ended up being a blessing in disguise. The forced time off school gave us a chance to reconnect and talk through some of the issues that had been building up since the divorce. He went back to class with a better attitude and a renewed focus on his grades. Trevor Morrison, perhaps chastened by his own father's reaction to the neighborhood code enforcement drama, stopped making comments about our family situation. The microscope incident cost us $847, but Jake worked off the debt by doing yard work and home maintenance projects around the neighborhood. Several of our neighbors hired him to help with the modifications required by their city violation notices, which turned into a small but steady source of income and gave him practical experience with construction and home improvement. Sarah came by the house one Saturday in November to pick up some items she'd left behind. It was the first time we'd been alone together since the divorce was finalized, and the conversation was awkward but not hostile. She looked good, healthier and happier than she'd been in the last years of our marriage. Her yoga instructor had apparently helped her find more than just physical flexibility. "The house looks good," she said, glancing around the kitchen where we'd shared so many meals and conversations over the years. "You're taking care of it." "Trying to. The HOA keeps me honest." She smiled at that, remembering some of my previous rants about Patricia Henley and her measuring tape tyranny. "I heard about your war with the Homeowners Association. Jake was very proud of how you handled it." "It got a little out of hand, but we worked things out eventually." "That's very diplomatic of you. The version I heard involved you bringing down half the neighborhood with code violations and forcing the HOA president to apologize." News traveled fast in suburbia, especially when it involved dramatic confrontations between authority figures. By now, the story had probably been embellished and retold enough times to bear only passing resemblance to what actually happened. "People like their stories to have clear heroes and villains," I said. "The reality was more complicated." Sarah nodded, understanding the dynamics that had shaped our own story as well as the neighborhood drama. "Most things are. But I'm glad you stood up for yourself. You were always too willing to avoid confrontation, even when confrontation was exactly what the situation needed." It was an insightful observation that probably applied to more than just HOA disputes. Maybe if I'd been willing to confront the problems in our marriage directly, instead of hoping they'd resolve themselves, we might have found a way to work through them. Or maybe we would have ended up divorced anyway, but with less resentment and more mutual respect. "How are you doing?" I asked. "Really?" She considered the question seriously, which was one of the things I'd always appreciated about Sarah. She didn't give casual answers to serious questions. "Better. It was the right decision for both of us, even though it was painful to get here. I'm happy, Tom, happier than I've been in years, and I hope you can find that too. I'm working on it. Jake and I are in a better place than we've been since you left. Emma calls more often, and she's planning to come home for Christmas. Work is stable, the house is paid for, and the roof doesn't leak. By most measures, life is good. But I'm still figuring out what comes next. For a long time, my identity was wrapped up in being a husband and father and homeowner. Now I'm a divorced single father and homeowner, which is different enough that I'm still adjusting to who that person is supposed to be." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed my hand briefly, a gesture of comfort between old friends rather than former spouses. "You're a good man, Tom. You always were. You just got lost for a while trying to be everything to everyone. Maybe now you can figure out how to be yourself." After she left, I sat in the kitchen for a long time thinking about identity and purpose and the strange ways that life forces you to confront your assumptions about yourself. The fight with Patricia Henley had started as a reaction to unfair treatment, but it had ended up teaching me something important about standing up for principles and refusing to be pushed around by people who mistook authority for righteousness. More importantly, it had shown Jake that his old man wasn't completely powerless in the face of adult bureaucracy and suburban politics. For a 17-year-old dealing with his own sense of powerlessness in the aftermath of his parents' divorce, that lesson was probably more valuable than any lecture about responsibility or resilience. Christmas came and went with less drama than usual. Emma came home from college full of stories about her classes and her friends and her plans for studying abroad next semester. Jake had his first serious girlfriend, a smart and funny senior named Maya who actually seemed to enjoy our family's slightly sarcastic sense of humor. We cooked dinner together and played board games and watched terrible holiday movies, creating new traditions that fit our smaller but more relaxed family dynamic. On New Year's Eve, I found myself standing on the back deck looking out over the neighborhood where I'd lived for 12 years. Most of the houses were dark, their occupants either asleep or celebrating somewhere else. But here and there, windows glowed with warm light, suggesting lives being lived and stories being written behind those walls. Patricia Henley's house was one of the bright ones. Through her back windows, I could see what looked like a small party, Friends and family gathered around her dining room table, laughing and talking and sharing the kind of end-of-year celebration that makes suburban life worth the mortgage payments and HOA fees. 6 months ago, I would have felt nothing but irritation at the sight. Now, I felt something closer to neighborly satisfaction. We'd found a way to coexist without making each other miserable, which was probably the best outcome anyone could expect from small-scale community politics. My phone buzzed with a text from Jake, who was at Maya's house watching the ball drop with her family. "Happy New Year, Dad! Thanks for being awesome this year." It was a simple message, but it carried more weight than he probably intended. This had been the year I'd learned to be a single father. A year I'd stood up to neighborhood bullies. A year I'd started figuring out who I was when I wasn't trying to be everything to everyone. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe I was finally learning how to be myself. The ball dropped at midnight, marking the official end of what had been one of the most challenging and transformative years of my life. As the fireworks exploded over the city skyline in the distance, I made the kind of resolution that actually meant something. To keep standing up for what was right, to keep being present for my kids, and to keep building a life that felt authentic rather than performative. Behind me, the house was warm and quiet, filled with the accumulated history of more than a decade of family life. The mailbox still had a few rust spots, and the lawn still had some brown patches, but they no longer felt like symbols of failure. They were just the normal wear and tear of a house that was being lived in by people who cared more about substance than appearance. In the spring, I ran for the HOA board and won by a comfortable margin. My campaign platform was simple: reasonable enforcement of reasonable standards, with an emphasis on community building rather than community policing. Patricia Henley supported my candidacy, which surprised some people but made perfect sense to anyone who understood that former adversaries can become effective allies when they share common goals. The board position was exactly as tedious and thankless as I'd expected, but it was also surprisingly rewarding. We managed to resolve several long-standing community issues through collaborative problem-solving rather than bureaucratic enforcement. The neighborhood's property values actually increased, partly because we'd addressed some genuine infrastructure problems and because potential buyers were attracted to a community that seemed well-managed without being oppressive. Jake graduated from high school with solid grades and a plan to study engineering at the state university. Emma decided to transfer closer to home, partly for financial reasons and partly because she'd realized that family connections were more important than prestigious geography. I got promoted to regional sales manager, which came with more responsibility but also more flexibility and significantly better pay. And through it all, the house at 1247 Maple Ridge Drive remained home. Not perfect, not pristine, but comfortable and welcoming and filled with the kind of imperfect happiness that makes suburban life worth the effort. On a warm evening in late summer, exactly 1 year after Patricia Henley's first violation notice, I was grilling burgers in the backyard when I noticed a new family moving into the house across the street. The moving truck was blocking traffic. Children were running around the front yard, and the parents looked overwhelmed by the chaos of relocating to a new community. I walked over with a cold beer and introduced myself, welcoming them to the neighborhood and offering to help with anything they needed. The father, a guy about my age named Rodriguez, accepted the beer gratefully and asked about the community, the schools, and the homeowners association. "The HOA is pretty reasonable," I told him. "Just keep your property maintained and don't do anything too crazy without checking the rules first. The president can be a little intense about enforcement, but she's fair and she's willing to work with people who make an effort." He nodded, looking relieved. That's good to hear. We were worried about horror stories we'd heard about homeowners associations. "Every community has its challenges," I said, "but most problems can be solved if people are willing to communicate and compromise." As I walked back to my house, I realized that somewhere along the way, I'd become the kind of neighbor I'd always wanted to have. Someone who welcomed newcomers, helped resolve problems, and contributed to the community rather than just complaining about it. It wasn't the life I'd planned when Sarah and I first moved to Willowbrook Estates with dreams of raising our family in suburban harmony. But it was a good life, built on lessons learned through conflict and compromise, strengthened by relationships that had survived testing, and grounded in the understanding that home isn't just a place you live, it's a place where you belong. The burgers were perfectly cooked, the evening was warm and peaceful, and my son was bringing his girlfriend over for dinner. Patricia Henley's house glowed with lights from her latest dinner party. The new neighbors were settling into their new home, and somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower hummed with the sound of someone taking care of their small piece of the American dream. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough.